political theory that it is okay for the government to control the flow of information. And the government certainly tries hard to do that today. There's an ongoing guerrilla war between users of the internet and censors of the internet. And the censors tighten their filters all the time, and the users find clever ways to get around them. And it's this kind of cat and mouse game that goes on all the time. But the government is quite serious in its belief that it has the right and indeed the responsibility to decide what people can read and what they can think. A way that this played out historically was it made it very difficult for intellectuals to get together in groups to trade information. And one drag on the intellectual development of China in the late imperial period was the lack of something equivalent to the Royal Society in England, where you had a free flow of information among free intellectuals who were not being interfered with by the public authorities. In China, something like the Royal Society, a scientific information organization, would have been condemned as a clique or a faction. Very interesting, the word that is used today for political party, Dan, initially would have meant something like clique or cabal. It was very much condemned. Officials were not supposed to form cliques. They were not supposed to form parties. Everyone was supposed to take their ideology from the emperor and from the official Confucian examination system. And any attempt to discuss these issues on a private, organized basis was very strongly condemned. Of course, this is not just China. The rulers of most pre-modern countries thought and acted the same way. Censorship was found all over the world. But China's hostility to free thinking, I think you could say, has a very long history behind it. Third thing I wanted to mention is China's self-image as the Middle Kingdom, Zhonghua. It's very interesting. That term appears first in literature of about the 4th century BC, and it's a rather neutral term. It just means the central states, plural. China in the late 1st millennium BC was divided into a number of competing or warring states. It's called the Warring States period. And Zhonghua just meant the several states of the North China Plain were surrounded by other states on the periphery, so that it was not a value-laden term. But by the time you get to the Han Dynasty, by say 100 or so BC, the Middle Kingdom really meant the Middle Kingdom. And Chinese emperors were quite convinced that they ruled over all under heaven, as I like to say, and their throne was the exact center of the cosmos. And this idea of China as the central kingdom, I think, is still very much a part of Chinese sense of cultural continuity and national pride. Chinese devoted lots of resources over the long run in aggrandizing themselves and in impressing foreigners. One reason that the Forbidden City is as grandiose as it is that foreign embassies would come from Korea and Mongolia and Vietnam and other peripheral, quote-unquote, barbarian states. And the ambassadors were expected to be awed by the Forbidden City, and they usually were. It's a pretty awesome place. The treasure fleets that the Ming Dynasty sent into the Indian Ocean in the first third of the 15th century were wildly uneconomical, and they were really not about trade at all. They were about impressing other people with the grandeur of the Chinese state. And I think you can see exactly the same thing going on with the Olympics last year. You see exactly the same thing going on in Shanghai, which has just announced that it's planning to spend $45 billion on public works projects to get ready for Expo 2010. An astounding amount of money, and it only makes sense as an expression of rather grandiose Chinese self-image and a desire to impress the rest of the world. And I think that there's a kind of Middle Kingdom mentality going along with that. Related to that is a sense that China's rightful status as the Middle Kingdom and as the most central and most important country in the world was deeply, deeply insulted by a couple of centuries worth of imperialism, beginning in the late 18th century and continuing up into the 20th century, a sense of historical victimhood that draws on deep cultural and historical memories of the Opium Wars, the sacking of the Summer Palace in 1860, that infamous sign in the Shanghai Park, which may well be apocryphal, but everyone believes that there was a sign saying no dogs or Chinamen allowed. The Nanjing Massacre, a lot of very bad things that happened in China that were not just bad things in themselves, but a real insult to Chinese sense of personhood and nationality and national culture. This explains in part China's sensitivity to Japanese militarism, prime ministerial visits to the Yasukuni Shrine always draw protests in China. Now, of course, throughout East and Southeast Asia, everybody wants Japan to acknowledge responsibility for World War II, but that sense is particularly strong in China. There's a sense still today of resentment of foreign bullying on things like exchange rates and intellectual property and counterfeit goods. I sum this up by saying that Mao in 1949 stood on Tiananmen and said, "China has stood up." And that statement really, really resonated in China. China had been underfoot to the imperialist powers for a very long time, and this was a real insult to the Chinese sense of who they were and where they should be. And China standing up was important in 1949 and it remains important today. That's related to a very strong sense of Chinese nationalism, and that's something with not such deep historical roots. There was not even a real word in Chinese for nation-state until the 19th century, when the word was coined to translate that word from English. Sun Yat-sen really had to invent nationalism in China. There wasn't any such thing before he created a nationalist revolution, but Chinese have made up for lost time. There's a very powerful sense of nationalism in China today. And you see that emerging very quickly in China. That nationalist revolution in 1911. By 1919, the May 4th demonstration is specifically an expression of Chinese nationalism, protesting the anti-Chinese provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. And this national identity is very strongly cultivated by both the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party. Nationalism is seen in current attitudes towards space and time. If you go to China and go to a museum or talk to a historian, you hear over and over and over again, China has 5,000 years of history, or sometimes people say China has 8,000 years of history. Chinese are constantly using their archaeological heritage to say that they had the earliest this or that in the history of the world. There was just a find of pottery in Hunan province last week, which has been associated remains have been radiocarbon dated to about 17,000 years ago, which would make it the oldest pottery ever found anywhere in the world. And the Chinese are very, very pleased with that idea. You go to museums now and look at the labels of Neolithic objects, and very often you will see things ascribed to the period of the Yellow Emperor. Now, we're all pretty well convinced that the Yellow Emperor is a mythical being, but more and more in China, he's being treated not as just a mythical culture hero, but as an actual person from whom the Chinese people are descended. And I met a Chinese professor 2 weeks ago who showed me, actually, on paper, a very elaborate genealogy showing his personal descent from the Yellow Emperor. And he went into a rant about how the doubting antiquity movement, which was part of the May 4th movement, the kind of scholarly re-examination of Chinese history, had hoodwinked the Chinese people into rejecting Yao and Shun and the Yellow Emperor and these other heroic figures who were the founders of Chinese culture. So that really impresses me. I think that this kind of emotional nationalism is going to be a very, very potent force. And you see this particularly today in I said that was Chinese attitude toward time, also the Chinese attitude toward space.